Imagine a world balanced on the edge of a sword. The year is 1571, and the sun rises over a Mediterranean that belongs almost entirely to one power, the Ottoman Empire. For more than a century, the banner of the crescent moon has advanced relentlessly across continents and seas. From the smoking ruins of Constantinople to the deserts of Arabia, from the Danube to the gates of Vienna, the Ottomans have built an empire unlike anything seen since the days of Rome. To the Christian world, they are an unstoppable force, brilliant, efficient, and terrifying. The heart of this empire beats in Istanbul, once Constantinople, a city that still remembers the hymns of the Byzantine priests, who sang as the walls fell in 1453. The great Hagia Sophia, once the most sacred church in Christendom, now echoes with the call to prayer. From its domes, the Sultan's empire radiates outward, a living machine of conquest, faith, and order. Every morning, galleys glide across the Bosphorus, loaded with goods, soldiers, and slaves. In the shipyards of the Golden Horn, thousands of craftsmen hammer, saw, and forge, turning raw wood and iron into the vessels that rule the seas. The Ottoman Navy is more than a military force. It is a symbol of inevitability. Long, sleek galleys slice through the Mediterranean waters, driven by the relentless rhythm of hundreds of chained rowers. Most are captives. Christians taken in raids across the Aegean, Italians and Greeks, Spaniards and Dalmatians, men whose bodies have become part of the Ottoman machine. Above them, on the decks, stand the Sultan's finest warriors, the Janissaries, soldiers bred from childhood to fight, to obey, to conquer. They are the living embodiment of Ottoman discipline. When the Sultan commands, his orders travel from the marble halls of Topkapi Palace to the farthest reaches of his dominion. His armies march like the tide, his admirals sail as if guided by divine wind. And in 1571, the Sultan, Selim II, son of Suleiman the Magnificent, casts his gaze once more toward the west. The empire of his father had reached its zenith. Hungary subdued, North Africa under control, the Mediterranean nearly enclosed within Ottoman dominion. Only one final obstacle remained: a fractured, weakened, divided Christendom. But Europe was dying from within. The Protestant Reformation had torn it apart. Catholics and Protestants slaughtered each other in the name of the same God. Kings and popes schemed not against the Ottomans, but against each other. France, though Catholic, had made cynical pacts with Istanbul to weaken the Spanish Habsburgs. England, consumed by its own turmoil and the rise of Elizabeth, turned its back on the Mediterranean altogether. The Holy Roman Empire, once a beacon of unity, was now little more than a name, its authority hollow. Only a few held the line. In Madrid, King Philip II of Spain watched the creeping advance of the Crescent with grim determination. Spain was stretched across the world, from the silver mines of the New World to the ports of Naples and Sicily. But Philip understood that if the Ottomans took control of the Mediterranean, the entire balance of power would collapse. To him, the struggle was not merely about territory. It was a holy war, a defense of Christendom itself. In Venice, the most powerful maritime republic of the age, the situation was dire. Once the undisputed mistress of Mediterranean trade, Venice now found her lifelines strangled by Ottoman blockades and piracy. The fall of Cyprus, Venice's jewel in the Eastern Sea, was the final blow. After a year-long siege, the Venetian garrison at Famagusta was promised mercy. Instead, its commander, Marc Antonio Bragadino, was flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and paraded through the streets of Istanbul. Europe trembled at the story. And in Rome, Pope Pius XII, a Dominican monk turned pontiff, understood what was at stake better than anyone. He was no mere spiritual leader. He was a man of iron faith and pragmatic vision. He knew that the Turks would not stop at Cyprus. If left unchecked, their fleets could soon be at the mouth of the Tiber, their soldiers marching toward the Eternal City. The bells of Christendom would fall silent beneath the call of the muezzin. The 16th century was an age of transformation, of gunpowder and printing presses, of faith and fire. The old world was collapsing, and the new one was being born in blood. On one side stood the Ottomans, heirs to a 1,000-year tradition of conquest, wielding the most formidable military machine on earth. On the other stood a fragmented Europe, exhausted by internal wars and suspicion, yet still burning with pride, ambition, and belief. The Mediterranean became the stage of this grand drama. To the Ottomans, it was a Turkish lake, a domain of dominance, where their galleys could strike any port and enslave entire villages overnight. To the Christians, it was the last frontier, the last line of defense between their civilization and annihilation. Every island, every harbor, every wind that blew across that sea carried whispers of fate. The balance could not last. The Sultan's ambitions, the Pope's warnings, the merchants' losses, and the cries for vengeance all converged toward a single, inevitable storm. Somewhere in the future, ships would meet on open water, and the Mediterranean would run red. But before that day came, alliances had to be forged, heroes had to rise, and an ancient world had to decide whether it would die or fight. As the crescent moon rose higher in the sky, casting its pale light over the domes of Istanbul, the world held its breath. The greatest empire of its time was preparing to strike, and the fate of Western civilization would soon be decided not in the courts of kings, but in the roar of cannons, the clash of oars. In the wake of Cyprus's fall, Europe reeled as if struck by a thunderbolt. The news spread like wildfire through cathedrals and marketplaces, whispered in the taverns of Venice and prayed over in the chapels of Spain. The horror of Famagusta, Bragadino's flayed body displayed like a banner of humiliation, was not just an act of cruelty, it was a message. The Ottoman Empire wanted Europe to know that no fortress, no republic, no Christian stronghold could withstand its will. Yet that same act of terror, meant to crush hope, instead ignited it. For the first time in generations, the rival powers of Christendom began to see that survival required unity. At the center of this desperate effort stood Pope Pius XII, a man of frail body but unbreakable spirit. His white Dominican robes belied the steel within him. From his chambers in the Vatican, he sent out letters to kings and doges, pleading, reasoning, even threatening in the name of God. He spoke not as a politician, but as a prophet.
To me, men!
Europe, he warned, stood on the edge of the abyss. If the faithful continued to quarrel while the Crescent advanced, then not only their lands, but their souls would be lost.
Envelop them!
The Pope's voice carried across the courts of Europe, and slowly, against all odds, men began to listen. Venice, humiliated but unbroken, was the first to answer. The Doge and the Senate, surrounded by the golden mosaics of San Marco, swore vengeance for Cyprus. Their galleys, their shipwrights, their navigators, all would serve in a new crusade. From the west, King Philip II of Spain hesitated. Spain's might was unmatched. Its empire stretched from Peru to the Philippines, but its enemies were many. Rebellion smoldered in the Netherlands. English privateers prowled the Atlantic, and the treasury groaned under the weight of endless wars. Yet Philip was not a man to ignore divine duty. He saw himself as the chosen defender of Catholicism, the sword of God's justice. If Christendom was to rise, Spain must lead. But Spain and Venice were ancient rivals. For centuries they had fought, traded, and schemed against each other in the same seas. Their ambassadors distrusted one another. Their admirals whispered insults behind closed doors. It would take a miracle to make them allies. And that miracle came in the form of faith and the iron will of pious thefts. Through endless negotiations, through compromises measured in ships and ducats, through tears and tempers, the alliance began to take shape. Genoa joined, as did the Papal States. Knights from Malta, from Savoy, and from the Order of St. Stephen pledged their swords. By May of 1571, a coalition had been born, the Holy League. It was a fragile unity, bound not by love but by necessity, and sealed not with trust but with fear. Each member had its own motives. Venice sought revenge and protection of trade. Spain sought to defend its empire and its faith, and the Pope sought to save the soul of Christendom itself. Yet for all their differences, one thing united them: the conviction that this war would decide the fate of the world. But an army without a leader is a body without a head. The Holy League needed a commander, one who could command not just fleets, but the loyalties of men who despised one another. It was Philip II who proposed the name that would change everything: Don Juan of Austria. At 24, Don Juan was already a legend. The illegitimate son of Emperor Charles V and half-brother to King Philip himself, he had grown up in shadow, hidden from the court that whispered about his birth. Yet within that obscurity, a destiny was forming. He had been raised among scholars, trained by soldiers, and tempered by hardship. When his brother finally acknowledged him, Don Juan stepped into the light not as a courtier, but as a warrior. He had already proven his worth by crushing the Moorish revolt in Granada, showing both mercy and ruthlessness, qualities that would mark his career forever. To the men of Spain, he was the embodiment of chivalry, handsome, daring, and devout. To the Venetians, he was an outsider, but one who carried the authority of Spain's empire. To the Pope, he was the instrument of God's will. When he arrived in Messina, Sicily, to take command of the assembled fleet, the harbor erupted with cheers and trumpet calls. Sailors climbed the rigging to catch a glimpse of the young commander, and priests raised crucifixes in blessing as his galley approached. Don Juan, clad in armor polished to mirror brightness, stood at the bow, the wind catching his crimson cape. Those who saw him that day swore he looked more like a figure from legend than from flesh. A knight out of time, sent to redeem an age of doubt. The sight before him was staggering. The harbor was a forest of masts, a sea of sails emblazoned with crosses, lions, and eagles. The fleet was a mosaic of nations: Spanish galleons towering with heavy artillery, Venetian galleys sleek and deadly, Genoese ships built for speed, papal vessels adorned with holy emblems. Nearly 250 ships gathered there, an armada unlike any the Mediterranean had ever seen. Yet beneath the banners and fanfare, tension simmered. Each admiral brought not just men, but pride. Each nation had its own traditions of command. The Venetians distrusted Spanish arrogance. The Spaniards mocked Venetian caution. Don Juan would have to forge unity where centuries of rivalry had sown division. He began not with orders, but with presence. Walking the decks, eating with sailors, speaking to rowers, he learned their names and their fears. His charisma was magnetic, his confidence contagious. He knew that courage on the sea was born not only of discipline, but of belief. To some he spoke of faith, to others of glory, and to all he promised one thing, that the banner of the cross would not fall while he lived. Slowly, the murmurs of doubt began to fade. The men started to see not Spaniards or Venetians, not Papal or Genoese, but brothers bound by a single cause. But amid the fleet's preparations, a quiet revolution was taking place. In the shipyards of Venice, a new kind of vessel had been built. Massive, hulking beasts of war that dwarfed the traditional galleys. They were called galleasses. Unlike the slender ships of old that relied on oars and boarding tactics, the galleasses were floating fortresses. With raised decks and heavy artillery, they could unleash storms of iron from afar. Many doubted them. Veteran captains scoffed at their size and their sluggishness. A galley must dance, they said, not crawl. But Don Juan saw something others did not. He saw the future. These ships, he believed, could change the very nature of naval warfare. He ordered 6 of them to form the vanguard of his fleet. It was a bold gamble, and one that would soon decide the fate of empires. As summer deepened, the armada gathered its final strength. Messina buzzed with life. Smiths hammering cannonballs, priests blessing banners, officers studying maps by candlelight. Every day, more ships arrived. The harbor could hardly contain them. Don Juan moved among them like a conductor before a symphony, aligning divisions, assigning commands, and calming disputes with a mix of charm and authority that few could resist. To his right would sail Giovanni Andrea Doria, the seasoned Genoese admiral whose name alone struck fear in corsairs. To his left, Agostino Barbarigo of Venice, proud, wounded by the loss of Cyprus, and burning for vengeance. In the center, Don Juan himself would lead from the royal galley, its prow gilded and its sails white as the robes of angels. Behind the main line, a reserve of Spanish and Venetian ships under the Marquis of Santa Cruz stood ready to strike wherever the line faltered. It was a formation born of discipline and daring, designed to hold against the storm that was coming. Far to the east, in the shipyards of Istanbul, another fleet was taking shape. Under the command of Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha, the Ottoman Empire was preparing its response. 300 galleys, sleek, swift, deadly, were gathering, their hulls glistening with fresh tar, their oarsmen whipped into readiness. The Sultan's orders were clear. Seek out the Christians and destroy them. No peace, no prisoners. The victory at Cyprus had filled the empire with confidence, bordering on arrogance. Many Ottoman captains already argued over the spoils of the next conquest, whether to sack Sicily or push onward to Rome. 2 civilizations were steering toward collision. On one side, the disciplined might of the Sultan, rooted in centuries of conquest. On the other, the fragile unity of the Holy League, bound together by faith and desperation. Both believed themselves the instruments of divine will. Both were certain that God sailed with them. And somewhere, between those certainties, destiny waited. As the fleets readied for war, Don Juan spent his final night in Messina in quiet contemplation. Alone in his cabin, he gazed at a small crucifix hanging above his desk. The flickering light of a single candle cast long shadows across his face. He knew the odds. He knew that he commanded men who mistrusted one another, against an enemy who knew only unity and purpose. But he also knew that faith could make men invincible. In his diary, he wrote a single line that night: "We go to fight for the freedom of the world." At dawn, the horns sounded. The sails unfurled like wings. The harbor exploded with shouts and prayers as the Holy League set forth. Hundreds of ships moved as one, their oars striking the sea in perfect rhythm, their banners catching the wind. Priests stood on the decks, blessing the men, sprinkling seawater as if it were holy. Above them, sunlight glimmered on steel and gold. From the cliffs of Sicily, the townspeople watched in awe as the fleet disappeared over the horizon, vanishing into the endless blue. The world was holding its breath again. The cross and the crescent were sailing toward each other. And somewhere beyond the curve of the sea, history was waiting with open arms. The summer of 1571 burned slowly into autumn, and still the sea held its secrets. The Holy League fleet, a living leviathan of timber and steel, cut its way eastward through the blue expanse of the Mediterranean. Behind them, the harbors of Messina had fallen silent, the cheers of the crowds fading into memory. Before them stretched an ocean of uncertainty, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the greatest naval force of the Ottoman Empire waited. Every dawn, men awoke to the sound of drums and the creak of oars, each stroke pulling them closer to destiny. The journey was not merely a passage across water, but a test of endurance and faith. The Mediterranean could be a cruel master. One day it lay calm as glass, its surface shimmering like polished marble beneath the sun. The next, it turned violent, lashing the ships with sudden tempests that sent waves crashing over the decks. Men prayed, cursed, and sang as they worked the oars. Priests moved among them, murmuring blessings, the scent of salt and pitch mixed with sweat and smoke. In those long days at sea, time lost meaning. Only the horizon remained constant, that thin, endless line between earth and eternity. Don Juan of Austria stood often at the prow of his flagship, the Real, his gaze fixed on the east. He had the bearing of a knight and the patience of a sailor. Around him, the fleet moved in disciplined formation. 3 divisions stretched across miles of open water. To his right sailed the Genoese Admiral Giovanni Andrea Doria, his ships sleek and well-drilled. To the left, Agostino Barbarigo's Venetian galleys glided in proud silence, their banners bearing the golden lion of St. Mark. Behind them, the reserve fleet of Alvaro de Bazan, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, followed like a shadow, ready to strike wherever needed. Each night, as the sun sank into the sea and the sails turned crimson in the dying light, the men whispered among themselves. Some spoke of the riches they would win, others of the forgiveness they sought. But all felt the same weight pressing upon them, the knowledge that they were part of something larger than life, larger than kingdoms or empires. They were sailing not just to fight a battle, but to decide the fate of their civilization. News of the Ottoman fleet came in fragments. Rumors carried by fishermen, whispers from spies. The trembling testimonies of merchants who had seen black sails on the horizon. Some claimed the Turks had already sailed north toward Corfu. Others swore they were still in their ports near Lepanto, waiting for the wind. Every report contradicted the next, and uncertainty gnawed at the commanders. Don Juan convened councils aboard the Real, poring over maps under flickering lamplight. The air was thick with argument, the Venetians urging haste, the Spaniards preaching caution, and the Genoese calculating every possible outcome. Don Juan listened, but in the end, he trusted his instinct. "We will find them," he said quietly, "and God will decide the rest." As the fleet pressed eastward along the coast of Greece, tension rose with each passing day. The sea seemed too calm, the sky too clear. The silence before the storm was almost unbearable. At night, when the stars reflected off the water like 1,000 distant fires, men lay awake beneath the sails, staring upward and wondering if they would ever see those stars again. Somewhere out there, a fleet 300 ships strong was also sailing, and every stroke of the oar brought them closer to each other. Then, on the night of October 6th, as the Holy League anchored near the Ionian coast, the wind changed. A cold current swept down from the north, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke. And something else, something that made the veterans' blood run cold: tar and pitch. The smell of a fleet on the move. Scouts sent ahead returned before dawn, their faces pale. They had seen lights on the horizon, countless lanterns, flickering like fireflies in the darkness. At sunrise, the truth revealed itself. As the mists lifted from the Gulf of Patras, lookouts on the Real shouted a single word that sent ripples of electricity through the fleet. Sails! From the highest mast, Don Juan saw them, first as dark specks, then as shapes, then as a vast line spreading across the horizon like a storm front. The Ottoman fleet had come. 300 galleys, their hulls black and gleaming, their banners a sea of green and gold, advancing with the slow inevitability of fate. The water between the two armadas shimmered with light, as if the sun itself was watching. The Christian fleet erupted into motion. Drums thundered, orders echoed across the decks, and men rushed to their stations. The priests raised crucifixes high, blessing every ship, every cannon, every trembling soul aboard. The sails were furled. The oars dipped. Slowly, methodically, the Holy League formed its battle line. To the north, Barbarigo's Venetian wing extended like a blade. To the south, Doria's Genoese ships angled to meet the enemy's flank. In the center, Don Juan positioned his own galley and the 6 Venetian galleasses, those massive experimental warships that many still doubted. The decision to place them at the front was audacious. They were slow and heavy, vulnerable if isolated. But Don Juan saw them as immovable fortresses, floating walls of cannon that could break the Ottoman charge before it reached the main line. He ordered them forward, their prows facing the enemy, their decks bristling with artillery. Beneath them, the sea churned as hundreds of slaves rowed in perfect rhythm, dragging the monstrous ships into position. The sound was unlike anything heard before, a deep, rhythmic heartbeat of wood and iron. Across the water, the Ottoman fleet began to mirror the movement. Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha commanded from the center aboard the Sultan's great galley, its decks crowded with janissaries clad in white turbans. To his right sailed Mehmed Sirocco, a veteran of countless battles, and to his left, the fearsome Uluch Ali, an Italian convert to Islam, once a Christian fisherman, now one of the most feared corsairs in the Mediterranean. Each division was a masterpiece of discipline and precision. The Ottomans had done this 100 times before. Victory seemed to them a matter of routine. But that day, the sea would teach them something new. As the two fleets drew closer, the air grew thick with tension. The sky was a flawless blue. The wind gentle from the west, perfect conditions for a galley battle. Don Juan's officers gathered around him one final time. "When the signal is given," he said, his voice calm but carrying across the deck, "we will advance together. No man is to break formation. Remember, this day, the fate of all Christendom rests upon our hands." Then, in an act that would echo through the centuries, he ordered a massive crucifix to be raised upon the mast of his flagship. The figure of Christ, arms outstretched, caught the morning light as if blessing the fleet. Don Juan knelt and prayed, his men following his example. From ship to ship, thousands of voices rose in unison, chanting hymns that rolled across the water like thunder. On the opposite side, Ali Pasha raised his hand, and the drums of the janissaries began to beat. The rhythmic thunder of the oars followed, hundreds upon hundreds of oars striking the water in perfect synchronization. The Ottoman fleet surged forward, 300 ships moving as one. The sound of the oars was like the march of giants, the sea foaming white beneath them. Don Juan waited, his fleet holding position. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing upon him, not fear, but a vast, electric stillness, the kind that comes before lightning strikes. Around him, the galleasses began to creak as their cannons were loaded. Powder smoke curled lazily into the air. When the distance between the two fleets shrank to a mile, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, at Don Juan's signal, the first Venetian galleass unleashed its fury. The roar shattered the silence. A storm of iron tore across the water, and the sea itself seemed to explode. Ottoman galleys at the front of the formation disintegrated under the impact, their hulls splintering, their decks vanishing in clouds of fire and screams. The galleasses fired again and again, each broadside a hammer blow. The disciplined advance of the Ottoman fleet dissolved into chaos. Ships swerved to avoid the wrecks, their oars snapping, their formations collapsing. The smoke thickened, turning the morning sun to blood-red haze. For the first time in generations, the invincible navy of the Sultan had been stopped cold. The sea between the fleets boiled with flame and debris. Don Juan watched it unfold, his jaw set, his eyes burning with a terrible calm. The secret weapon, the galleasses, had done their work. But this was only the beginning. Beyond the drifting smoke, hundreds of Ottoman ships were still coming. Their oars flashed in the sunlight like the teeth of a predator. The battle that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean, and perhaps the fate of civilization itself, had begun.